You walk into a grocery store today, and the prices of basic necessities have quietly doubled, while your paycheck remains stubbornly the same. You open your phone only to be flooded with news of massive corporate layoffs, rising geopolitical tensions, and artificial intelligence rapidly replacing human jobs. The world currently feels incredibly heavy, as if the very foundations of our modern society are actively trembling beneath our feet. It is in the exact middle of this overwhelming chaos that a very specific, deeply unsettling phrase keeps echoing across the internet. People everywhere are whispering nervously about a great reset, completely convinced that this global instability is not a tragic accident, but a meticulously orchestrated plan. Before we rush to debate the factual accuracy of this massive claim, we need to pause and dig into something far more profound. We absolutely have to ask ourselves a very deep, psychological question about our current collective state of mind. Why, exactly, does the terrifying narrative of a grand global reset feel so incredibly logical and deeply resonant to so many of us right now? To truly understand this viral phenomenon, we first need to separate the dull reality of economic policy from the highly cinematic narratives born online. Originally, the term simply referred to a boring, highly bureaucratic global discussion about restructuring the shattered economy in the wake of recent global events. It was fundamentally just a series of theoretical white papers about sustainable growth and digital infrastructure, discussed by disconnected politicians in expensive, tailored suits. However, once that bland corporate concept hit the digital ecosystem, the collective imagination of a highly stressed public completely transformed its meaning. On social media platforms, it rapidly morphed into a sweeping, terrifying narrative about a shadowy elite forcefully changing the entire systemic structure against our will. We must clearly acknowledge the massive difference between a dry public policy discussion and the viral, fear-driven version that currently dominates our feeds. Yet even fully knowing the mundane origins of the phrase, the dark, conspiratorial version of the story still feels surprisingly accurate to our daily lived experience. This happens largely because the highly complex world we are currently navigating actually does look and feel fundamentally broken to the average citizen. When you constantly witness massive legacy institutions failing and traditional financial systems buckling under pressure, your brain instantly searches for a rational, overarching explanation. It is incredibly easy to look at a deeply chaotic, failing system and immediately conclude that a powerful group of masterminds must be engineering the collapse. This dark conclusion actually provides a strange psychological comfort, because believing that someone is in control is infinitely less terrifying than admitting the system is just broken. Chaos naturally creates a desperate, burning human need for a grand, unifying explanation that can suddenly make sense of the absolute madness. Furthermore, this grand narrative perfectly aligns with the brutal, undeniable reality of our current financial uncertainty and rapidly growing economic despair. We are living in a highly volatile era where average salaries remain completely stagnant, while the dream of owning basic property slips further away every single year. Job security feels like an outdated concept from a forgotten generation, especially as highly advanced algorithms threaten to automate even complex, creative professional tasks. When your personal financial survival feels like a highly rigged game that you are constantly losing, the idea of intentional manipulation feels emotionally logical. If the entire financial game is secretly rigged, then your personal struggles are not your fault. They are simply the direct result of an invisible restructuring. But we also have to deeply examine the fascinating, flawed biological machinery inside our own heads to truly understand why this idea takes root so strongly. The human brain is an ancient, highly evolved pattern recognition machine that absolutely despises randomness, sudden uncertainty, and mere statistical coincidence. We are biologically wired to seamlessly connect completely unrelated dots, heavily preferring to see a hidden predator in the bushes rather than just the wind. We are vastly more comfortable fully believing in a highly structured, intentional global plot than simply accepting that our incredibly complex world is wildly uncontrollable. Our minds are relentless pattern seekers, and when presented with global chaos, they will inevitably stitch together a grand narrative to ward off the sheer terror. This natural ingrained human vulnerability is then aggressively amplified and actively weaponized by the incredibly sophisticated algorithms that silently dictate our daily digital consumption. Social media platforms do not fundamentally care about nuanced, boring economic truths. They care entirely about keeping your eyes glued to the screen through intense emotion. A dramatic, highly edited video screaming that the world is about to permanently change will always generate vastly more clicks than a dry lecture on market cycles. The digital landscape heavily rewards absolute extremes, constantly pushing narratives of hidden global agendas because those stories perfectly trigger our primal survival instincts. These platforms effortlessly trap us in highly customized echo chambers, relentlessly feeding us content that perfectly confirms our deepest, darkest suspicions about the future. Before very long, what started as a mild economic anxiety rapidly blossoms into a fully formed, completely unshakable belief in a dystopian master plan. The stories we constantly watch act like a mental script, completely altering how we perceive the raw footage of our everyday reality. We become the unwitting editors of our own worldview, constantly cutting out the boring facts and heavily highlighting the terrifying, suspenseful moments. However, it is absolutely crucial to eventually step out of that digital fog and actively acknowledge one very real, undeniable truth about our modern era. The world actually is undergoing a massive, unprecedented transformation, and the fundamental rules of the global economy are indeed being rapidly Rapid digitalization is fundamentally altering how capital flows across international borders, forever changing the basic mechanics of global trade, commerce, and personal wealth. The explosive rise of artificial intelligence is actively disrupting massive industries at a completely unprecedented pace that we have never witnessed in human history. We are undeniably living squarely through a massive global economic shift, accompanied by a terrifying, deeply visible widening of the massive wealth gap. But we must utilize our absolute critical thinking to draw a heavy, distinct line between acknowledging this systemic change and believing in an evil conspiracy. Massive systemic changes are very often just the messy, highly chaotic result of natural economic evolution colliding violently with groundbreaking technological adaptation. Sometimes, a massive global shift is not a secret plot hatched in a dark room, but simply the inevitable progression of historical cycles violently repeating themselves. Human society has historically always evolved through periods of intense, painful destruction heavily followed by rapid, confusing periods of incredible innovation and renewal. We are currently standing exactly in the middle of one of those deeply painful transitional phases, where the old analog world is slowly dying. As the old structures crumble, the new, highly digital world is desperately struggling to be born out of the confusing, terrifying technological ashes. This brings us directly to a deeply necessary, profound reflection on how we individually choose to spend our limited time and mental energy today. Why do we become so absolutely obsessed with uncovering the hidden identities of the hypothetical elites who might be secretly ruling the world? We spend countless hours endlessly debating who is maliciously pulling the strings, completely neglecting the urgent need to build practical skills for the new economy. These intense, paralyzing focus on an uncontrollable grand narrative is ultimately just a psychological distraction from the heavy, intimidating responsibility of our own adaptation. It is vastly easier to angrily complain about a supposedly rigged global reset than it is to sit down and actually master a complex new technological tool. But true empowerment in a chaotic, heavily shifting world never comes from successfully predicting the apocalypse or unmasking the invisible villains of the digital age. True, unshakable power strictly comes from radically shifting your intense focus away from the chaotic macro narratives and intensely toward your own micro-environment. You absolutely must aggressively prioritize the absolute control of your own mindset over the entirely futile attempt to control the shifting global narrative. Developing highly adaptable, high-income skills will practically protect you infinitely better than any deep-dive internet theory or viral social media video ever could. When the fundamental structure of the entire economy shifts, the individuals who truly survive are always those who choose relentless adaptation over paralyzing speculation. You cannot manually stop the massive waves of digitalization, artificial intelligence, or shifting global finance from crashing violently onto the shores of our society, but you can absolutely choose to quickly build a highly resilient, unsinkable ship by investing deeply in your own education, financial literacy, and mental toughness. Let the highly frightened masses entirely consume themselves with the endless pursuit of uncovering a master plan that they can never truly approve. You must quietly and strategically use this exact same period of extreme global chaos to quietly forge yourself into someone utterly indispensable to the market. The massive technological disruptions we are constantly seeing are merely the chaotic friction of human progress, not necessarily the calculated malice of a hidden dictatorship. When you finally stop aggressively looking for the invisible boogeyman deep within the financial system, you suddenly realize how much personal agency you actually possess. The absolutely most dangerous trap is not the rapidly shifting global economy itself, but the viral, contagious belief that you are simply a helpless victim. Reject that terrifying, disempowering illusion entirely, and actively take complete, unapologetic ownership of your own personal financial trajectory in this rapidly changing world. If there truly is a massive, historical restructuring of wealth and opportunity occurring right now, your primary goal should simply be positioning yourself perfectly You successfully accomplish this by becoming highly fluent in the brand new languages of advanced technology and decentralized finance, rather than just complaining. The massive, historical cycles of economic boom and inevitable bust are entirely indifferent to our personal anxieties, our online debates, and our viral conspiracy theories. These forces simply sweep cleanly through society, relentlessly clearing away the massive, outdated systems and heavily rewarding those who are agile enough to immediately pivot. Every single hour you spend falling deeply down a digital rabbit hole of geopolitical paranoia is an hour permanently stolen from mastering your specific craft. The ultimate, most effective rebellion against a chaotic, deeply uncertain world is aggressively cultivating an absolutely unshakable, deeply focused, and highly skilled mind. Do not ever let the complex digital algorithms entirely dictate your fragile emotional state. And do not let the fear of a reset paralyze your momentum. You hold the absolute, undeniable power to actively curate your reality, sharply edit the raw information you consume, and strictly direct your own daily actions. The entire world is absolutely going to change, with or without your explicit permission, and the massive transition will undoubtedly be uncomfortable and incredibly messy. But perhaps the massive, terrifying global reset we constantly read about online is not exactly what it appears to be on the chaotic surface. The fear itself is merely a deeply psychological lens, heavily distorting the objective reality of inflation, geopolitical tension, and normal market cycles. When traditional fiat currency rapidly loses its purchasing power, people desperately seek alternative assets like digital tokens to preserve their rapidly shrinking wealth. This completely logical financial defense mechanism is often intensely misconstrued as a shadowy global plot to completely abolish traditional money forever. The reality is simply that incredibly smart people are just historically reacting to heavily flawed monetary policies by actively seeking stronger, more reliable financial vehicles. It is a highly rational, historical response to a failing economic system, not the final stage of a terrifyingly perfect, inescapable, grand conspiracy. Similarly, when massive corporations suddenly shift their massive labor forces entirely toward artificial intelligence, they are simply pursuing brutal, cold, mathematical efficiency. They are completely driven by the absolute necessity to maximize quarterly profits, not by a secret, malevolent desire to intentionally enslave the working class. While the immediate human consequences of this rapid technological shift are deeply tragic and incredibly painful, the underlying corporate motive is entirely transparent. Understanding this cold, harsh reality is vastly more empowering because it allows you to clearly see the real rules of the modern economic game. If you mistakenly believe the game is entirely, perfectly rigged by an invincible elite, you will naturally just surrender and wait for the inevitable end. But if you deeply understand that the system is simply a highly complex, chaotic machine ruthlessly optimizing for efficiency, you can successfully learn to adapt. You can actively choose to upgrade your own personal operating system, entirely replacing your outdated fear-based programming with highly adaptable, resilient new software. You can aggressively study the exact same technological trends that are heavily disrupting the old world, and use them to violently construct your own future. The absolute most successful individuals in human history never merely survived periods of massive global chaos. They actively aggressively leveraged the chaos to their advantage. They completely refused to be paralyzed by the overwhelming, deafening noise of public panic, and instead, they focused intensely on finding the hidden, lucrative signal. Right now, the collective societal signal is completely drowned out by the incredibly loud, viral static of endless online paranoia and fear-mongering narratives. It takes immense, incredible psychological discipline to actively tune out that terrifying frequency and sharply refocus your attention entirely on what truly matters. Your immediate physical health, your deep personal relationships, and your highly valuable professional skill set are the absolute only true assets you actually control. Everything else is simply a distracting, highly dramatic movie playing out on a digital screen, heavily designed to siphon away your precious, limited attention. Do not willingly give away your incredibly valuable mental energy to the hypothetical villains perfectly constructed by the endless depths of the modern internet. Reclaim your total psychological sovereignty by firmly grounding yourself entirely in the tangible, physical reality of your own immediate, highly controllable environment. The so-called elites absolutely do not magically control whether you choose to spend your evening learning a new high-income skill or endlessly scrolling through social media. They do not remotely dictate whether you choose to aggressively invest your money in strong assets or recklessly waste it on rapidly depreciating liabilities. The invisible, terrifying global powers cannot forcefully prevent you from radically changing your daily habits, improving your deep focus, and aggressively mastering your own mind. Those vital, daily micro-decisions completely compound over long periods of time, ultimately building an absolutely impenetrable fortress around your personal financial future. When you successfully build this high level of extreme internal resilience, the massive, terrifying narratives of a grand global reset suddenly lose their psychological grip. You begin to completely view massive global changes not as a terrifying, unavoidable apocalypse, but simply as a shifting landscape that requires a new map. A highly skilled navigator does not angrily curse the violently changing winds. They simply, calmly adjust their sails and aggressively plot a brand new course. You absolutely must become the calm, highly calculated navigator of your own financial ship, entirely ignoring the screaming, panicked passengers on the chaotic deck. The world has historically always been a deeply dangerous, highly unpredictable place, heavily filled with massive systemic failures and entirely unexpected, terrifying black swan events. But humanity has also always possessed an absolutely incredible, boundless capacity for profound innovation, radical adaptation, and spectacular, unexpected recovery from the brink. We are not merely passive, helpless victims entirely trapped in a predetermined, dystopian simulation perfectly designed by a cabal of untouchable billionaires. We are highly active, incredibly capable participants in a massive, unfolding historical drama, and we actively hold the pen that ultimately writes our own ending. The profound sense of helplessness you currently feel is precisely the incredibly toxic product that the modern fear economy is aggressively trying to sell you. Refuse to absolutely buy into their terrifying narrative. Completely cancel your mental subscription to collective panic, and radically invest entirely in your own competence. The massive, sprawling financial system may indeed be incredibly fragile, highly inflated, and entirely prone to spectacular, devastating collapses in the very near future. But your ultimate individual ability to entirely survive that collapse is completely independent of the deeply flawed macroeconomic structure that surrounds you. True, lasting wealth is fundamentally generated by actively solving complex human problems, and periods of massive global chaos naturally create an endless abundance of entirely new problems. If you can rapidly train yourself to aggressively spot these new problems and efficiently provide highly valuable solutions, you will absolutely thrive in any economy. The Great Reset, in its most viral, terrifying, internet-fueled form, is ultimately just a deeply fascinating mirror reflecting our own profound, collective insecurities. It perfectly highlights our deep lack of trust in modern institutions, our intense fear of rapid technological change, and our absolute dread of financial ruin. But simply staring endlessly into that terrifying, dark mirror will absolutely never magically fix the underlying, structural problems of your own personal reality. You must eventually smash the mirror entirely, step forcefully out of the highly manipulated digital illusion, and boldly enter the challenging arena of real life. The actual, physical world deeply requires strong, highly capable individuals who remain incredibly calm, incredibly focused, and deeply rational when everyone else is violently panicking. Be the incredibly rare, highly valuable person who entirely ignores the terrifying shadows on the wall and aggressively focuses strictly on building the absolute fire. The massive, disruptive changes that are actively coming are completely unavoidable. But your ultimate, personal failure in the face of those changes is entirely optional. You completely possess the intellectual capacity, the technological tools, and the absolute freedom to violently rewrite your own personal code before the system rewrites it for you. Stop passively waiting for the highly corrupt, massive global structures to magically collapse, and start aggressively building your own highly resilient, completely independent financial architecture. The truly prepared individual absolutely does not endlessly fear the coming storm. They simply use the violent winds to entirely power their own personal windmill. We must actively elevate our collective consciousness entirely above the highly toxic, deeply paralyzing frequency of widespread, algorithmic fear and endless geopolitical suspicion. We need to fiercely demand absolute intellectual rigor from ourselves, refusing to easily accept terrifying, simplistic answers to incredibly complex, highly nuanced global problems. A highly complex, rapidly evolving world fundamentally demands a highly complex, deeply adaptable mind that completely refuses to be easily manipulated by dramatic narratives. Your ultimate absolute focus must remain fiercely locked entirely on the relentless, daily pursuit of complete personal excellence and absolute financial sovereignty. Let the massive, faceless corporations and the deeply disconnected politicians continue to foolishly play their massive, highly destructive games of global macroeconomic chess. You must completely step off their massive board entirely, absolutely refuse to be their pawn, and aggressively design a completely different game that you can actually win. The historical narrative of total, inescapable global doom is simply the very ultimate, most highly effective form of psychological suppression ever invented by modern society. By deeply internalizing this absolute, paralyzing fear, you are voluntarily placing incredibly heavy, restrictive chains directly onto your own massive, boundless potential. Break those invisible chains today by radically committing to extreme, relentless personal accountability, profound financial education, and absolutely unyielding emotional control in the face of chaos. The world absolutely does not need another terrified, perfectly compliant citizen completely paralyzed by the looming threat of an invisible, grand global plan. It desperately needs incredibly strong, completely independent thinkers who deeply understand the brutal mechanics of the system but completely refuse to be broken by it. You are entirely capable of becoming this exact type of powerful, highly unshakable individual, but it requires completely abandoning the comfortable, warm blanket of collective victory. You must willingly step out into the freezing, uncomfortable cold of absolute personal responsibility, completely armed only with your own deeply honed, Hovalius skills. The massive, historical transition we are all actively experiencing is ultimately just a brutal, entirely unbiased test of our own collective human adaptability and resilience. Those who desperately cling to the comforting, terrifying narratives of total systemic conspiracy will inevitably be violently swept away by the massive, changing tides, but those who quickly learn to deeply understand the terrifying ocean, perfectly read the changing currents, and incredibly master their own ship will absolutely conquer it. The immense, terrifying power to absolutely decide which group you permanently belong to rests entirely, firmly, and exclusively inside your own hands, right now. It is entirely a choice between complete, paralyzing, psychological surrender to the terrifying internet noise, or absolute, total commitment to your own personal empowerment. Choose empowerment. Completely silence the deafening algorithmic noise, and aggressively focus all of your precious energy entirely on massive, tangible, and highly strategic daily action. The global economy will absolutely continue to violently fluctuate. Massive technologies will relentlessly disrupt, and highly dramatic, terrifying viral narratives will definitely always emerge. But your own internal, deeply built financial foundation can absolutely remain completely entirely untouched by the massive, chaotic storms raging violently across the surface. This is the absolute true essence of genuine, long-lasting power in an incredibly uncertain world that constantly tries to forcefully convince you that you have none. It is the quiet, deeply radical realization that your own ultimate success or failure is entirely disconnected from the massive, overarching plans of the so-called global elite. You are the ultimate, absolute architect of your own personal reality, entirely regardless of whatever terrifying, chaotic narrative is currently trending on the digital timeline. So the very next time you see a highly viral, deeply terrifying video angrily proclaiming that the massive, global reset is finally here, simply pause and breathe. Quietly acknowledge the very real, underlying economic anxieties that completely fueled the creation of that terrifying content, but absolutely refuse to adopt its paralyzing fear. Actively redirect that intense, nervous energy directly into aggressively learning a brand new software, deeply studying a complex financial market, or violently improving your own physical health. Use their incredibly toxic, viral panic as the absolute ultimate, highly explosive fuel to aggressively accelerate your own personal journey toward total, absolute independence. The deeply terrified masses will always endlessly stare at the massive, shifting shadows on the wall, completely convinced that the terrifying darkness is actively coming for them. But you absolutely must be the incredibly rare individual who entirely turns their back on the terrifying shadows and completely walks directly toward the actual light. You must aggressively become the absolute master of your own highly specific domain, fiercely protecting your own mental clarity with absolutely everything that you currently possess. Because when you completely strip away all of the highly dramatic, viral internet noise and the deeply complex economic jargon, a singular, undeniable truth powerfully remains. The only massive, completely foundational restructuring that you ever actually have absolute, total control over is the rapid, relentless evolution of your own incredible mind. Perhaps the most vital, life-altering change that desperately needs to happen right now has absolutely nothing to do with the massive global banking system. It has absolutely nothing to do with exposing the highly guarded, deeply hidden agendas of the incredibly wealthy billionaires who seemingly control the entire massive global stage. Ultimately, the absolute only real, permanent, and highly effective change that can truly save you is the fundamental, massive restructuring of your own internal perspective. The massive, terrifying chaos outside will absolutely always exist in some constantly shifting form, but the profound clarity inside your own mind is a completely impenetrable fortress. You absolutely must fiercely build, aggressively upgrade, and completely protect that incredible mental fortress from the relentless, daily bombardment of highly viral digital panic. If you can successfully manage to completely upgrade your own mental software during a period of massive, terrifying global panic, you have already won the ultimate game. You have successfully achieved the absolute highest form of human resilience, entirely transcending the highly toxic, deeply paralyzing fear that completely controls the vast majority. So stop endlessly waiting for the entire massive, incredibly broken global system to suddenly, magically reset itself into something completely fair and totally transparent. That highly idealized, perfectly balanced utopia is absolutely never going to arrive. Entirely, regardless of how many highly viral, terrifying conspiracy videos you constantly watch online. The brutal, highly objective reality is that the absolute only massive, deeply structural reset that is completely guaranteed to incredibly improve your own daily life is your own. It is the absolute, quiet, and highly deliberate decision to completely reset your own deeply ingrained, highly limiting beliefs about exactly what is truly possible. It is the aggressive, relentless, daily pursuer of absolute personal excellence, entirely, completely divorced from the terrifying, highly chaotic narratives constantly pushed by the modern media machine. You are incredibly, undeniably powerful, deeply capable of massive adaptation, and entirely equipped to absolutely thrive in this rapidly changing, highly unpredictable new global landscape. Completely own that incredible power today. Aggressively master your chosen, highly valuable craft, and absolutely refuse to endlessly participate in the highly toxic, collective hallucination of victory. The absolutely massive, terrifying global changes that are rapidly coming are not the tragic, unavoidable end of your personal story, but merely the chaotic, violent beginning. They are the incredibly fertile, highly disruptive ground upon which you will aggressively build your own, absolutely magnificent, deeply unshakable, and incredibly resilient personal empire. So step entirely out of the massive, terrifying digital shadows. Completely silence the highly contagious algorithmic fear and boldly begin the incredibly massive, incredibly vital work. Because at the absolute end of the long, chaotic day, maybe the only thing that truly, desperately needs a massive, complete reset is not the entire global system. Perhaps the only massive, truly profound thing that urgently requires a complete, foundational reset right now is entirely the way we choose to view the chaotic world. The ultimate choice of how to proceed in this chaotic era is completely and undeniably yours to actively make today. Choose to entirely reset your own powerful mindset, absolutely ignore the viral panic, and confidently conquer the rapidly shifting future that eagerly awaits you.